Reworking a character in a video game is no easy task. It's much harder than making a character from scratch, as you have to fit the new kit around the pre-existing model, while addressing all the pain points associated with the previous kit, but you also can't start from scratch, as even the most hated characters still have a devoted community that absolutely adores that character in their kit, which means you also need to carry over all the positive aspects of their old kit that people liked. Because of these extra hurdles that developers need to jump through when it comes to reworks, it's unfortunately quite common to see reworks completely fail. For instance, if a game had 100 characters, you might see 8 of them end up getting reworks. But out of those 8 reworks, 5 of them would miss the mark and end up requiring multiple further iterations before they get the character right. Sometimes the reworks simply don't fix the problems they set out to address, other times they do fix the issue but end up introducing a new problem to take its place. But sometimes, just sometimes, the developers hit the nail on the head first try and bless players with a perfect rework, bringing old and outdated characters into the modern era beautifully. And despite the various failed reworks in Dead by Daylight's history, we have had one that was a huge success: the Doctor. That revelation may come as a shock to you, because when you think of reworks in DBD, killers like Skull Merchant or Freddy are the ones that will come to mind, certainly not the Doctor. But yes, he has indeed been reworked, twice according to behaviour. While his original release definitely had the same theme and core aspects to his kit as his modern day counterpart, there were several functional differences. For instance, some of you may not know that he used to be a stance switcher, a character that can freely swap between 2 kits mid-game. So let's take things back to the original version of the Doctor, that released all the way back on the 11th of May 2017. Upon spawning in as the Doctor, players would find themselves in Punishment Mode, a seemingly normal killer at 115% movement speed with a 32-meter terror radius, stick in hand, able to attack survivors like any other killer. Unlike today, there was only one ability on screen, labelled Treatment Mode. Upon holding the ability button, players would switch stances, immediately witnessing something previously unseen of killers. The Doctor would put his weapon away, which did indeed mean that in this mode, he had no way of dealing damage to survivors. But that's not all. Not only would he put his weapon away, but he'd also switch over to a brand new set of stats too, dropping his movement speed to 107.5%, even slower than slow killers like the Huntress, and he'd also swap over to a second terror radius, which also defaulted to 32 meters. Aside from the different stats, Treatment Mode also gave the Doctor a passive, Static Field. Any and all survivors within the Doctor's terror radius would slowly gain madness over time, entering tier 1 madness almost instantly, screaming and revealing their position. But they can even progress to tier 2 or 3 if they remain in his terror radius for long enough. Madness also decayed over time if you weren't in his Static Field passive. And instead of his weapon, he had Shock Therapy, which is very similar to his current day ability. By holding the attack button, the Doctor slows down substantially and shocks the floor in a cone in front of him, greatly increasing the madness of any survivor caught in its blast. There were also some slight differences to the madness debuffs across the tiers, like how often certain effects such as the fake terror radius would occur, but in the interest of keeping this video under 3 hours long, we'll brush past them. That being said, the release of the Doctor definitely came as a big shock, pun intended, to many survivor players, as against this killer, you can run, but you can't hide. And hiding was the go-to playstyle for a huge portion of the player base back then. There was no barbecue and chili, lethal pursuer, friends till the end, or anything like that in those days. Back then, a killer's best perk for finding survivors was whispers, a far cry from straight up seeing survivors' auras. Since many players relied much more on hiding, they weren't very good at chases, so the Doctor completely removing the viability of hiding and forcing survivors into chase caused a lot of frustration. But for survivors who knew how to loop, the Doctor was surprisingly weak. Yes, he could start a chase very quickly, but once the chase was underway, he was just a standard basic attack killer. While the fake red stain from madness could help him win some mind games, his ability hindered him in chase far more than it helped him. Just for being in treatment mode, he'd already become slower than every killer other than Myers and Nurse, and he'd get even slower every time he shot. Not to mention that shocking took even longer than it does nowadays. And no, I'm not exaggerating about how weak his power was, as back then, his shock only increased the survivor's madness level and did not lock survivors out of actions like it does today. Things only get worse when we take a look at the add-ons. While practically all of them have had minor changes to how they affect madness, there's a few add-ons with more substantial differences. For instance, the Doctor's bread and butter since day one, the Electrode add-ons. These 3 add-ons increase the range of shock therapy, but back in the day, these core add-ons came with a hefty cost of substantially increasing the amount of time it took to perform a shock, which was already pretty slow back then. Here's a side-by-side comparison of modern day base kit shocking versus old base kit shocking. And here's old base kit shocking versus old double range shocking. Shocking, I know. Unfortunately, there was no escaping this slow charge time either, as at least one electrode was practically required. But it wasn't all bad. There was one add-on that the Doctor would only dream of having nowadays. Obedience, Carter's Notes, which made snapping out of it take 2 seconds longer and made any survivors in Tier 3 Madness permanently exhausted, alongside the particularly unique gameplay that came with the Calm add-ons, which made his terror radius bigger in treatment mode but smaller in punishment mode. While something very similar exists today, making it bigger or smaller depending on the cooldown of your secondary ability, it was particularly interesting on that iteration of the Doctor due to him being a stance switcher, which allowed him to increase and decrease his terror radius at will. Paired with his own perk Monitor and Abuse, which could further decrease his terror radius, the Doctor was practically Ghostface before we had Ghostface. While treatment mode may have left him unable to attack, it was still better than Freddy's old power because there's one mechanic that it didn't disable: grabs. While survivors can still get grabbed off gens, totems and doors to this day, killers used to be able to grab survivors midway through the unhook animation too, to punish bum rushing and unhooking right in the killer's face. Much like old hatch standoffs, unhook grabs were basically a game of chicken. If the killer hit the survivor before they started unhooking, then the survivor could complete the unhook while the killer was wiping their weapon. But if the survivor started the unhook before the killer attacked, then the killer could grab them, instantly downing them. Whoever made the first move would lose. Survivors would often try to bait the killer into swinging by partially starting an unhook but quickly letting go before the killer could grab them, which would then turn it into a hit if the killer fell for it. But the Doctor turned this on its head entirely. Since merely the act of switching stances was considered to be the Doctor's ability, this meant that shocking was considered an attack, even though it didn't deal damage. Since shocking wasn't instant and required channeling first, he could just let go of the button to cancel it, being able to start charging a new one immediately. This meant that in an unhook standoff, the Doctor could just spam the charge button over and over to instantly win any unhook standoff, as each time he began charging, it counted as a grab attempt. Since there was no anti-camp self-unhook bar back then, if the Doctor wanted to face camp somebody, there was absolutely no way for survivors to intervene, making him the OG face camp extraordinaire before Bubba. All of this left the Doctor in a rather unhealthy spot. Survivors who wanted to hide simply couldn't do so and ended up dying pretty quickly, but survivors who knew the basics of looping were practically unaffected by his power, which earned him the reputation of DBD's first noob stomper, particularly excelling at slaughtering weaker players but being absolutely useless against good ones. Over the next 2 weeks after his release, he received some very slight quality of life changes, such as increasing treatment mode's movement speed from 107.5% to 110% speed, the same as the Huntress, increasing the range on his shock slightly, and increasing the time it takes to snap out of it from 4 seconds to 12. But the effects were practically unnoticeable. That being said, a little over 3 months later came a very special update to Dead by Daylight titled The Doctor Cube, which was hyped up to be a full-on rework to the Doctor, with cubes being a naming scheme that Behaviour planned to use for big overhauls and reworks coming to the game. I never understood what they meant by cube. I've never heard devs of any other games use this name before, and I don't get what about it makes it cube-like. There must be something I'm not getting. If you know about it, please let me know in the comments, because this has confused me for like 7 years. Anyway, the Doctor Rework consisted of a few changes. Snapping out of it was now classed as healing in the game's code, which meant that it could be tracked with Nurse's calling or sped up with botany knowledge. It also now had skill checks. Madness skill checks were also now base kit instead of being tied to add-ons, with the likelihood of a madness skill check instead of a regular one now increasing depending on the survivor's madness level. Switching stances no longer applied an additional movement speed penalty. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that. While you were in the process of switching stances, you'd be slowed even more. This meant that using his ability would slow him 3 separate times. He'd be slowed heavily while switching stances, he'd be slowed a little bit in treatment mode, and he'd be slowed heavily again each time he shocked. And a few smaller changes again tweaking how the madness debuffs would work. Alongside one huge buff. Shocked survivors can no longer interact with anything after being shocked, which lasts for 2.5 seconds. This, as you might imagine, had a sizable impact on how he played. But before we get into that, let me just clarify, this wasn't a rework. Behaviour have always been very loose with their usage of the term rework, and this isn't the last time it happens. A rework is straight up re-kitting a character, a new ability, a new passive. Think about original Freddy compared to current Freddy. That's a rework. This, however, is a series of buffs. Don't get me wrong, these buffs were absolutely needed and this was a great update, but Behaviour's misuse of the term rework has always bothered me. And how did this cube affect him? Quite nicely, in fact. His ability now actually did stuff during chases, which made him better than Trapper, Myers, and Old Wraith, as locking survivors out of dropping pallets or vaulting windows is huge. Survivors couldn't just run him like any other killer and be fine. It required a change in how you play and how you navigate loops in order to succeed, whether that's pre-dropping before he gets the shock off or running straight through this loop to the next one. And now that the Doctor was an actual threat, I think it's a great time to talk about his design, lore, and immersion, which played a much bigger role than it does today. This character was truly designed from the ground up to be scary. Just take a look at his trailer. The ambience, how he jump scares Feng and doesn't even attempt to kill her, clearly preferring to keep her alive and torment her more, the manic breathing seemingly being giddy from excitement opposed to being out of breath, and that face. Unlike all the other killers in the roster at the time, he was the only one to truly revel in the torture he inflicts. Even Myers just kind of rolls with it like a machine, the rest are there by chance, only killing because the entity makes them. This isn't just my interpretation either, his lore fully backs this up. Seriously, the Doctor's original lore was so horrific that Behaviour straight up changed it. It originally ended with him peeling his mentor's skull open while still alive and placing various electrodes on his exposed brain before torturing him and frying his brain, leaving him forever in a vegetative state. This put him quite high on my list of DBD's most violent killers that I made a few years ago. The reason I bring this up is because it really carried over to his gameplay, particularly when playing against him. Hearing those earth-shaking shocks from across the map over and over again before eventually hearing them joined by survivors screaming. Don't get me wrong, you can still hear those things in the current version of the game, but it was so different back then. The bigger maps paired with the old audio and reverb really gave so much more depth to the picture being painted by those sound effects. And of course, not forgetting the jump scares. Madness also used to give survivors random jump scares, whether they were in chase or all by themselves in the middle of nowhere. It could strike at any time, but it was the way that these jump scares were executed that immersed players so perfectly. It wasn't just a render of his model or an artist's drawing of him. Instead, it was the rough imprint of his face and the devices protruding from his eyes and mouth, which made it seem so much more like the traumatic memory of getting a glimpse of him burned into the survivor's mind. But despite all these things, the Doctor was still weak and felt awfully clunky to play. While completely disabling a survivor's ability to drop pallets and vault windows sounds incredible on paper, its implementation still left him lacking. Even if you got a well-timed shock off, because of how drastically you'd slow down while doing so, the survivor could just loop the tile over and over again with no problem, as you lose so much distance every time you shocked. Pair that with how unbelievably clunky it felt to hold a button to change stances, lose movement speed, hold another button down for even longer, losing even more speed to shock before changing stances again just to get an attack off. The Doctor was far from a complete package. A year and a quarter later, snapping out of it was changed to not count as healing anymore, but that's all. Things needed to change. So, 2 years and 4 months after his last rework that wasn't really a rework, the Doctor got his first real rework with the following changes. Treatment mode was removed. The static field passive was removed. The Doctor was no longer a stance switcher. Pressing the ability button would now allow the Doctor to immediately charge up shock therapy without the need to switch stances first. Added a new secondary ability, Static Blast. After a long cooldown, the Doctor can activate Static Blast to instantly shock all survivors in his terror radius, immediately progressing them to the next tier of madness. Alongside various buffs like a longer base range on shock therapy, shorter time required to charge up a shock, less of a movement speed penalty when charging shock therapy, halving the decay rate of madness, and changing several of his add-ons, most notably the removal of exhaustion in tier 3 and the removal of the charge time penalty on the range add-ons, alongside the removal of his jump scares. Not only was this a real rework, but it also made the Doctor a real threat in chase. His ability is now so much more fluid and intuitive to use and loses a lot less distance for using his shock. Overall, the rework was a huge success, breathing new life into a previously weak and clunky character with improvement across the board apart from one category, his immersion. While the removal of the jump scares was a large portion of the loss of immersion, it isn't entirely to blame. The reduction in map sizes and changes to the audio and reverb of the overall game also made a difference. But considering all of the positives that this rework achieved for the Doctor, I think it's a worthwhile sacrifice. Since the rework, the Doctor has received a few more buffs like extending the range of his shock, shortening the delay of the shock, reducing the cooldown of his secondary ability, and the complete removal of madness decay. While he's never been at the top of the killer roster, he's never a bad option either.